So the title of my talk is Tiny Wonders and Great Designer. I'm a molecular biologist. I presently do mostly protein biochemistry is what I'm mostly involved in right now. But I want to talk to you a little bit about evolution and a little bit about how my particular field, I feel like, does a lot to help me personally see that there are other viable alternatives besides evolution in terms of what you're going to believe about origins. So first off, just a talk about what evolution is. Sometimes I feel like it's not displayed so blatantly in the textbooks that preach evolution, but this is what evolution is. Where first off, before this picture here, there's just a nothing picture, where nothing came together to be something, and then that something, which was individual tiny one-celled organisms, then gained more complexity through mechanisms that are not known and not explained, and then those new things made a new organism, new single-celled organisms. And those had much more complicated things going on inside of them than these original first cells. And in fact, this is similar in size in reality, that these cells are much exponentially smaller than these cells. And that then, after that, these things, by mechanisms once again unknown, gained information and gained structure and gained anatomical features to become something even more complicated. And this thing right here is one of the simplest organisms on Earth. And at the same time, then this, through evolution, became something even more complicated and grew these parts through, once again, mechanisms we don't necessarily know. And the part that they cut off here at the top is probably the most important part, which is also inexplicably there as well. So maybe it's an intelligent design thing, maybe it's a creationist thing, but we have separated this into what we call macro and microevolution. I don't know that those are terms that evolutionists use. Evolutionists use the term evolution to mean change for the better, an acquisition of new function and structure. This type of evolution is what I, as a creationist, do not believe in. I don't physically see, and I don't know of any explanation in the scientific literature or any data that's been published that can give me an explanation how this thing can become this thing. Not that it has to be this specific thing, but how this thing could have gained new information and new parts to have become something profoundly different. Not only is there not an example of this in the natural world, there is no mechanism even to postulate how that could happen in the natural world. How you can gain such profoundly new structures and functions, particularly when we're talking about proteins and genes, and how those things, when we look at the reality of proteins and genes, which we'll look at momentarily here, are really, really complicated and all work together so that you can't have just little pieces of them coming into existence and being maintained in the cell. Because the cells, particularly these tiny cells, if something wrong happens and they start making a protein that doesn't have any use, they will stop that immediately. And not only that, they'll usually kick it out of their genome. These are the types of guys that I work with. I'm a microbiologist. I study these types of things and these types of things. But for my career, I've studied these types of things. And they don't keep around DNA and proteins that they don't need. In fact, they have whole systems to make sure that they're never making proteins that they don't need. If they need something and that external indication comes in and they might need to start metabolizing a different type of sugar, then they'll wait to make sure that that's correct, and then they'll make up the proteins. They'll start making the proteins for the metabolism of those types of sugars. So they're very, very selective and careful with the energies that they expend. And for them to just gain new proteins that don't have a function, and then wait, however many thousands of years for them to gain a complementary protein that together would make some functioning unit of proteins, which is how our proteins work inside of our cell, is really a mechanism that defies explanation. There's no example of that, and it goes against everything that we know about these organisms. So evolution is actually change. And as a Seventh-day Adventist and as a scientist, I believe that there is change. So I will tell you that I do believe that things change. If you'd like to put the word evolution on that, then that's fine. But we do know that things change. It happens that over lunch there was a small discussion about Adam and Eve. And so I went and looked those things up. The truth is that as a Seventh-day Adventist creationist, we do believe that things change. Okay, and that is evident in the world that we see around us. Things have changed. We can know that. My understanding is that there was an island where there were no finches near Ecuador, near the Galapagos Islands, and that there was a hurricane and brought some of these birds onto the island. That was about 20 years ago. And now 20 years from there, we can look at them and look at their beaks and recognize that they have changed significantly from the source population that they came from the mainland. So only in 20 years, these guys have had a little bit of change in beak size based on what they're eating. Okay. Well, they're still birds, they're still finches, they still have beaks. They're not becoming a different animal, but it's just micro change. Now, if you look around the room, you'll notice that we are not all identical. Praise the Lord. We love being our individual selves. There is change that has taken place. Ellen White talked about change. She didn't talk about animals, but she did talk about humans. She talked about what Adam looked like when he was created. Like I said, this is something we were mentioning at lunch today, so I went and looked it up. She said that Adam came forth in two different places. One is in Selected Messages, where she said Adam was made about double the size of what what today's man looks like, which is quite big if we think, and we can estimate what that might be. Obviously, we are not a different species than Adam. We are Adam's children. We are the son of Adam. But yet we have certainly changed. We look different than Adam. We probably are not as attractive as Eve anymore. And obviously, we're not the same height. So this idea of things changing is something that we can see in the natural world and something that also fits into our view of what Scripture actually says, that there are small changes that take place within organisms. That doesn't mean that one organism becomes a different organism or gains information and becomes something significantly better. We're still humans. Most likely, we are probably worse off than Adam in terms of our intellect and capability. I don't really know how smart Adam was. Ellen White certainly makes comments about how intelligent those races were, those people were. And so probably we're somewhat far from that. However, at the time of Darwin, it was believed that animals, all the animals they saw in the world looked exactly like they did as they had come off the ark. And so this idea of change was not at all accepted, especially by the church. And so the idea that animals are exactly as we see them coming off the ark, Darwin was able to show that possibly that wasn't true by looking at his finches, basically, and saying, look, they look like the mainland finches, but their beaks are a little different. It's like they've changed. And that was astounding. Okay, it really was astounding to the scientists at the time, and they were looking for a reason to maybe not need to believe what the church had been teaching. Remember, we're just coming out of the Dark Ages where the church had been really oppressive. And to not have to believe this system is something that was a nice thing to be able to grab onto. So because the creationists at the time believed in this idea of fixity of species, which we don't find necessarily in the Bible, Darwin then and his ideas were able to take a good hold. Because he was able to show that, hey, there is some change taking place. That was the data that he had in his book, that there is change taking place. He then extrapolates that profoundly to say that because these beaks have changed a little bit, that all organisms have come from a series of changes and gains of information that have resulted in us today. I do want to talk about this. Note the extraordinary timing of the introduction of naturalism, which is the timing of what the scientific community believed, what the religious community believed at that time. The world was ripe for this type of what I believe is a delusion. And it was good science. I think that his science was right. He had measured the beaks. I think that was good data. But the extrapolation is really more than the data could support. Okay, the extrapolation that this type of change would result in what I just described to you before, with a microorganism gaining all these new functions to eventually produce an organism like me, is really a big extrapolation from changes in beak size. So all we have to do is take a look around the room and we can see there's been some changes in beak size. Okay, we know that there are changes certainly there. So at that very time, and I do feel like this is really important. I am a believer, as you can tell, that Ellen White received inspiration from God. And at that very time, when Darwin's views were taking effect on the world, God sent a prophet to say unequivocally, no, God was the creator. She said lots of other things, but certainly, absolutely, if you read Ellen White, there's no doubt about it. God is the creator as far as she's concerned, and she tells people that repeatedly. So I think it's really important, I think, to understand this timing and to understand God's response to it, which is to say, here's another prophet, and this prophet is saying my words, and my words are, I'm the creator. There's no possible way around it. So what I'm going to talk about today a little bit is the fact that I have seen and heard of many people, my own friends included, who go through university and maybe go through graduate school and they find some bit of data and it challenges them. For example, the reason Dr. Brand told the story about the fossil trees in Yellowstone National Park is because there was a Seventh-day Adventist, he happened to be a historian, who learned about the fossil trees. And because of that, he wrote a book about how the Bible is not true, and he convinced many Seventh-day Adventists, especially in California, to give up their belief. And after some careful research, I mean, we're talking hundreds of people left the church because of trees in Yellowstone. Okay, whether it's the church or whatever it is, hundreds of people stopped having a relationship with God because of trees, fossil trees in Yellowstone. And as we can see, after some careful research, that was not needed. They did not need to give that up because of that. And we find very often people will find one scientific data point and say, oh, because this is true, I can't believe the Bible anymore. And it may be that that's good data. And as a creationist, I don't have an explanation for it. As a creationist, I don't know why that is. It may be that that's a really bad interpretation. And as a creationist, I might need to go and study it more to really understand it. It might take a while, like the Yellowstone fossil trees did. However, it is interesting to me that there are multiple things in the natural world that have been published by creationists and published by secular scientists repeatedly that are huge challenges to the theory of evolution. And yet people are not as easily willing to give up that theory. But there are very many things that are huge challenges. So as I go through today, I'm going to talk just about a couple things, two things really, that I believe are really important challenges to evolution. But more importantly, to me, they are examples of the caring and beautiful nature of God's creation. So first off is complexity, and probably you've heard these types of arguments before. But this is what I study. This is a graphical representation of a bacteria. At the end of this bacteria, not all bacteria have this, but a lot do. They have a propulsion mechanism called a flagella. Now, human cells also have propulsion mechanisms, most notably in sperm. But the propulsion mechanisms in sperm are literally exponentially less complicated than the propulsion systems that are in bacteria. In sperm, they're basically two fibers, the same as muscle fibers. You know how muscle fibers move relative to each other? Well, sperm locomotion, the two muscle fibers, they're basically the two same fibers, except they're moving relative to each other linearly like this. And so you get a whip-like motion, and that's how sperm are propelled. In bacteria, you get something completely different. You have this very, very complicated mechanism right here called the flagellar motor, and that is what we call it. This thing is huge. I mean, literally, it's almost this size relative to the cell. It's a really, really huge thing. It's made of hundreds of different proteins. For me, the most important of which is something called Fly-M. Fly-M is the gas pedal to this thing. And Fly-M, it's called Fly for flagella, F-L-I. There's all these proteins, and this is just a little bit of them. These are really huge proteins. And this thing, it basically it's a rotary motor, so it spins like this, around and around and around, just like an electric motor does. But just like an electric motor, this thing either spins one direction or it spins the other direction. As long as the cell has energy, it will be spinning. But just like a motor, what's the point of having a motor if you don't have a mechanism to control it, right? So if your motor's just running along and you can't steer the car or you can't steer the boat, whatever it is. And so what I actually study are the steering mechanisms, the proteins that actually communicate to the flagellomotor and tell it what to do. Because that's the whole mechanism. What's the point, like I said, of having a propulsion mechanism if you can't decide where you're going? Here's just another picture of more of the proteins and how this thing sits in the in the membrane of the bacteria cells. So, like I said, this is actually what I study. These are the proteins that I'm studying right now. In fact, they're sitting back in my freezer, waiting for me to get back to them as soon as I get back to California. This particular protein sits in the membrane and it senses oxygen. It actually has an oxygen binding factor associated with it, which is heme, the exact same oxygen binding factor that we have in our hemoglobin. And here's a picture. This red part is actually the porphyrin ring that makes up heme. And oxygen sits right in here. And when oxygen sits in here, there is a conformation, a physical change, which is part of what we're trying to figure out. We know it's physical, but what actually happens, that's the signal, that's the motion. It's like flicking your kid on the ear. When you're trying to get them to be quiet in church, you can communicate with them in some way. You can shh, shh, shh. Sound is one way we can communicate with our children, or you can flick them on the ear. And it's a physical motion that has communicated, right? So here's a physical motion that is communication. And the end result of this is that we have phosphorylation by these proteins down here. And then those phosphorylated proteins go on to communicate with flagellomotor. And the flagellomotor, instead of going this direction, starts going this direction. Okay? That's the end result of this output. I will tell you more and more and more about that if you'd like, but we should probably go on. So this is just a diagram. It's incomprehensible, but I'm going to zoom in on one of these areas down here just to show you what this is. This is a diagram of the potential biochemical pathways that happen inside of a cell. Now, these biochemical pathways are, as you can see, here's one of them. All these blue words are basically enzymes. And then we have in black the thing that's being acted on, and the blue are these proteins that are acting on it. Now, if we go back and look at this slide, that was this pathway right here. Okay? All of the rest of these pathways also have to happen inside of a cell in order for a cell just to be a living cell. Okay? So these are what we call housekeeping functions. As a molecular biologist, we call these housekeeping genes. This is what must be functioning in order for a cell to be alive. Okay? And this particular one down here, this is fatty acid oxidation. This is the ability of your body to consume fats. Okay? Bacterial cells might need to do this because they have to make fats. They have membranes. Well, how do they get those membranes? They make those membranes, and they recycle those membranes. So they have to constantly be making fatty acids, and this is a mechanism of breaking it down. I'm going to now zoom in on this big thing right here. And once again, these are the basic functions that have to happen inside of a cell for it to be alive. This is the citrate pathway, the TCA pathway, or the, maybe you guys have heard of it before. This is a pathway by which almost all living organisms in the world generate energy. Okay, so this is one of the end pathways to burning sugar, or to burning 2 carbon units like fats, or to burning 2 carbon units that have come from amino acids. This is a really important pathway. If this pathway doesn't function, if even one of these things does not function perfectly, you will never have made it past a sperm, okay? It has to function perfectly in order for you to be alive. And all of these great big blue things here are proteins. I'm going to look at this one right here, succinate dehydrogenase. This is a giant protein with multiple domains. It has a heme in it also. Okay, the same thing that I'm kind of studying. It also has a FAD cofactor and iron sulfide clusters inside of this thing. This is a complicated thing. It has to be generated and has to be made perfectly in order for your cell to live. And Everything else in this pathway has to be generated and has to be being made perfectly in order for your cell to live. Okay, so in order for all these things to have lived, in order for them to have evolved, they all would have had to essentially come into existence simultaneously. Because in order to be a living cell, you have to have a membrane, and you have to be able to make proteins, and you have to have nucleic acid, and that nucleic acid has to be able to be replicated. So, which is most of what's going on here. And all of those things need to be present for there to be a living cell. So my point is with this, a cell is a lot more complicated than we used to know at the turn of the century. And I'm not talking about 2000, although it was a lot more complicated now in 2019 than in 1900. And back in 1900, when Darwinianism was really taking hold, they knew nothing about this. You can look at a timeline of biological experiments and biological information, and it's nothing. We didn't even know that DNA was an inheritable factor until after 1950. So this is really, really complicated stuff that Darwin knew nothing about. And in fact, if you were standing in front of a group of molecular biologists and you were just now proposing a theory of evolution and the molecular biologist knew all of this, you would probably be laughed off the stage. Because what we know now about molecular biology almost completely does away with the idea that these things accidentally came into existence to do all the functions that a living cell would need. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is just briefly about the nervous system, human nervous system. Number one, neurons. These are amazing cells. They're the most complicated cell in the human body. They're your brain cells. They're also the cells that can be up more than a meter long. A single cell that can go from your toe and stretch up all the way into your spinal cord. And the information that you receive from your toe, that information physically is being carried along a wire, and that wire is a cell. Okay, so when you scratch your toe or you've got an itch on your toe, it's because one of those extensions of that wire that stretches all the way up from your toe to your spinal cord has sensed something. I just stubbed my toe. Ow. And that thing is a neuron. Now, this is in your peripheral nervous system, which is the nervous system outside the central nervous system. It's not in your brain, obviously, but it's a similar cell to what's in your brain. These are pictures of cells that are in your brain. They are very, very complicated, and they have amazing mechanisms that go with them. So the mechanisms I showed you on the slide before, now take that and times it by 100, and you might know what's going on inside of a neuron. Even so, we have no idea what's going on inside a neuron. We're still working on that. These are very ancient animals called trilobites. They're extinct, but they're found in the geologic column in some of what are considered the oldest rocks. This is a graphical representation of that. Up here are the living things that we have, and here, this line right here indicates that we have no fossils beneath this. When you are looking in the rocks, this is a graphical representation of the rocks. As you look through rocks, you'll find really no fossils, a few very, very tiny things that look like fossils, and then all of a sudden, boom, there's a pile of fossils. Okay, one of the earliest fossils is this trilobite that now is no longer, it's dead, it's extinct. This is another picture of a trilobite eye, which looks exactly like a fly eye. This is a modern fly, and inside the modern fly, the fly's eyes are different than ours, as we know. Each of these facets here has a lens. They're multi-lensed eyes. At the back of each of these lenses is a neuron that goes from each lens, and of course we know that our optical nerve is highly innervated. Our eyes are very, very important. We have lots of nerves that go there. This is looking inside a fly's brain, and these neurons have been colorized. And you can see this really beautiful neuron. This is probably just one or two neurons that are lit up here. So they've lit them up, it looks like with green fluorescent protein. And you can see that these neurons are very similar to what human brains have and what human neurons look like. So a cell as complicated as a human neuron is present at the almost very beginning of life, according to evolutionists. Because these trilobites are found way down deep in these rocks that are, according to the standard model, very, 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 very old. And yet, this very, very complicated molecular system is found someplace very, very far down. Okay? So, And beneath there's no fossils. There's no data down here. We don't know anything about where these guys came from if you're an evolutionist. But it is presumed, based on the numbers of differences between modern insects and the trilobites, that they had a common ancestor sometime very, very long time ago, based on this, on their anatomical differences. But there is no data for that. There's no fossils. There's no intermediate there. Additionally, what is the human mind capable of? And according to the laws of evolution, things come into existence because they're needed by the environment. Okay, that's natural selection has to have something to act on. And so if you're living in the environment, you need to have gained some function that then your body or natural selection is able to act on. So I had to ask you, what is the human mind capable of? And is there an environment that would have brought that forth? For example, many of you here can do calculus or high-level math. Why is it that you need to be able to do high-level math? Is there an environment where you, as some tree-swinging variety of ape, would have needed to know calculus? Do you see what I'm getting at? Why do we love? Is there an environment where you would need to love in order to be able to reproduce? Why do we play music? Do you see what I'm getting at? That the human brain does things and is capable of doing things that I don't know, and I don't think that there is an environment that could have called those, that could have required those to be present in the human brain. And yet that's the tenet of evolution, that you have some sort of mutation, and because of the environment, it gets selected for and maintained in the organism, right? But the human brain is able to do things that are way beyond the necessities of our environment. Okay, if we were just looking at us as a reproducer, and all we need to do is reproduce our genes and pass them on, our brain does and expends a lot of energy doing things that we don't need to do if we're just reproducing. Okay, experiencing joy, experiencing music, experiencing love, imagination. Those things are far beyond what is needed in order to reproduce. Okay, the last thing I'm going to talk about is information. So if we were to walk along the road and we found something that looks like this, we would say somebody intelligent was there, right? Because you don't find rocks that look like this in the environment. Something made that, and it has purpose. In Southern California, in the desert, this is what Southern California looks like, the Mojave Desert, you sometimes come across things that look like this. And even though it no longer has function, you can look at it and say, well, somebody made that. It has functionality. It used to have functionality. Take a look at this little thing right here. Have you ever seen anything that looks like this? Maybe some of you have. I personally think it looks a lot like this. I don't know what you call it here in Spain or in Europe, but in the United States, we use this a lot as reinforcement for concrete. And in the United States, we build a lot with concrete. So we call this stuff rebar. It's steel that we lay down and then we pour concrete on top of it, and it gives our concrete strength. You guys are aware of you've seen these before? Okay, I don't know what you might call it, but it's very, very common. When I go to Mexico, they're like, oh, yeah, because Mexico, there's rebar everywhere. This rebar looks a lot like this. Now, this is not rebar, but these happen to have a superficial similarity. And it turns out that the way that this is used by the body is almost exactly the way our bodies use rebar. Our bodies use this stuff. This stuff is actually collagen. This is collagen that's called dense collagen, found in your tendons. So if you feel your knee, that really hard stuff that's not actually bone but moves is collagen. Collagen's also in our skin. It's this soft stuff that gives our skin strength and the ability to snap back when it gets pulled. So it goes back in the right space. Here it's dyed pink, and here it's not dyed pink. So in our own bodies, we take collagen and mineralize it. This is mineralized collagen, and when we mineralize it or pour minerals into it, it becomes bone. And in fact, bone fibers are mineralized collagen, so it's like almost petrified collagen that's in there. And in fact, when we're building, we do the exact same thing with rebar. Like I said, in the United States, we make lots of stuff where you lay rebar down and then you mineralize it with concrete, okay? Because that's the strongest thing. And that's the way the good Lord made our bodies as well. Mineralized rebar. So my question to you is, where does this rebar come from? This rebar in our cells, this metal that our cells make. So this is a picture of a steel mill, and it is a place that makes rebar. So out comes the hot metal. There's different types of machines. This is a block of hot metal. Different machines will squish it or make it shaped in different ways. They might make big coils of steel that you might see going down the interstate at some point. So like I said, different types of machines. Here we're getting something that looks more like rebar. So I have to ask you, this giant machine and this guy who's helping make it, is that the source of the metal that we use to make our buildings? The answer is kind of. Kind of it is, but in reality, you need someone like this. This fellow right here is my father, and he is the guy who designs the control systems for steel mills to make the metal. Okay? So you need an electrical engineer to come along and say, well, if we want to make metal that is this long and this big and this diameter, we're going to need this machine with this amount of tons torque power to make that happen. And when you plug it in, it's going to need a gazillion volts of electricity to make this whole thing function. And in fact, when he was working in India, he said, it's like we'd turn on the steel mill and all the lights would go off for 5-mile radius. So because it just drew everything was being sucked up. So you need someone to imagine this and to come up with it, and someone smart enough to design the plans to make that happen. Inside this cell, there is a rebar factory. There is a collagen factory that can make rebar. Okay? Just like there's a steel mill. But the real question is, the way we know is that if you have something that makes structure and function, you have to have someone intelligent on the outside telling you what to do, right? Because structure and function just don't happen without some intelligence on the outside. Now, I'm not suggesting my father is God, but I am suggesting that there is a God. I am suggesting that the natural world points to the fact that because there's information that is used in a functional way, that there is a God. I would like to encourage you with this belief. There's many, many things in the world that testify that there is a God. The psalmist says, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament showeth his handiwork. Day after day, they pour forth knowledge. Speech. Night after night, they pour forth knowledge. There is no language or tongue on the earth where their voice is not heard, which is to say the natural world testifies that there is a God. Romans, it reiterates that, where Paul says that by the things that are made, God's divine power have been clearly known. So this is an example, I feel, of the things that have been made. We can see that God's power is there. As Elder Zinke pointed out earlier, we can know that there is a God from the natural world. We can know that he is a personal God who loves us from the Bible.